Thank you so much, Walt, for that introduction. And I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on this evening, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I want to thank Auntie Joanne Self for that wonderful acknowledgement of country. Thank you. I want to thank all of you who've gathered here this evening, Walt Secord for his very generous introduction and for being the sponsor of this event tonight. My colleague Marjorie O'Neill, who's here as well. I know Marjorie is a great friend of the Jewish community. It's good to see you here tonight, Marjorie. I want to acknowledge Vic Aladeff, Dr. Dashiell Lawrence, my friend Alona Lee, and Sharon Offenberger. And lastly, but perhaps most importantly, I want to thank Sandra Tatz and the Tatz family for honouring me with the opportunity to give this lecture. I feel like I'm in very distinguished company, given that it was Stan Grant who gave the lecture last year. I was watching online. I think a lot of us were, only a few of us were allowed in the room last time, but there were many of us watching online. And it was a terrific speech that Stan gave last year. In Colin's memory, I want to speak tonight about the essential role that history plays in our democracy, and why we're stronger as a nation when we face our history with courage and confidence, and why we should always resist attempts by governments to censor that history. Recently, our Parliament, our federal Parliament, acknowledged the anniversary of the national apology to victims and survivors of institutional child sexual abuse. As everyone now concedes, these Australians experienced an unforgivable betrayal. But it was only after a Royal Commission revealed the undeniable scale of these crimes did the majority of Australians realise the extent of the abuse. Only then did we say sorry. On the anniversary of this apology, the Prime Minister told the Parliament, and I quote, "Days of reckoning have become an important part of our national story. The apology to the stolen generations, the apology for forced adoptions, the apology to the forgotten Australians and former child migrants. The apologies reflect our acknowledgement of our failures as a people. As a liberal democratic people, we aren't afraid of our history, nor do we recoil from engaging with terrible truths." Our Prime Minister said that. And in fact, it was one of the truest things that our Prime Minister has said. As liberal democracies, we can face our past, but I'd go one step further. We must. As liberal Democrats, as supporters of the free and open society, we stand or fall by our commitment to the truth. It's one of the things that separates us from totalitarians, people who want to erase uncomfortable memories from public life, who want to dominate the past in the way they dominate their people. We celebrate our successes and we face our failures with courage and the confidence that we can do better in the future. If you value living in a free society, you know that history is a precious thing. It's a gift, an endlessly fascinating, often surprising, always enriching gift. But it's also a tool. It has a purpose. We study history, and by doing so, we become stronger as a nation. I know that there are some people who say that we should only teach students the positives in our history, that we should downplay difficult or uncomfortable moments because they'll make our kids feel guilty or ashamed or unpatriotic. The Federal Education Minister, Colin Tatz, said exactly this recently. He said that history teachers should be, to use his words, less miserable and more optimistic, and stop examining events like Gallipoli. Now, I'm an optimist by nature and a patriot who loves her country deeply, but I'm not sure how we can study the bravery of Gallipoli without also admitting that the British command got it wrong, that their maps were inaccurate, that the landing site didn't have enough fresh water, that the whole mission was a massively risky gamble and a mistaken one in hindsight. This doesn't make the courage of our Anzacs less inspiring or their sacrifice any less meaningful. If anything, the full truth adds weight to their tragedy and courage. So when we study Gallipoli, when we remember these heroes, we're studying the bravery and defiance that came to shape our national character. Australian history is full of these moments, like the Great Shearers' Strike, or the wharfies on the Hungry Mile, or the eviction protests during the Great Depression. Erskineville is part of my electorate. The bailiffs would turn up to try and move families out of their homes, and people their neighbours would stop that. They'd fight them off. They couldn't fight them off permanently, but they tried to fight them off. Or the Eureka Stockade, which ended in a resounding defeat in 1854, but which pushed Victoria to establish an electoral democracy in 1856. These were moments when heroism was bound up in loss, when pain and struggle led to progress. History rarely offers us simple lessons. There's light and there's dark, and they're usually mixed in together. And this was something that Colin Tatz knew better than most. I feel truly privileged to be giving this lecture in his name tonight. It comes, I think, with an obligation to be honest, to avoid safe arguments or easy conclusions, because Colin never took the safe or easy path. Colin dedicated his life to studying humanity's darkest moments, when racial hatred produced mass murder. He studied genocide. As a Jewish boy who grew up in the shadow of the Holocaust, as a South African who lived through the barbarism of apartheid, we can understand Colin's preoccupation with historic evil. But on a personal level, it must have been phenomenally difficult, staring into the abyss as he did year after year. Really is difficult to imagine. In his memoirs, Colin talks about when he first learnt of the Nazi death camps, which would come to shape his life and scholarship. There was a movie theatre in 1945 during the Saturday matinee, which showed footage from Belsen as part of its newsreel. Before the footage began, a voice came over the loudspeakers telling the children there to cover their eyes. When confronted by the Holocaust, most of us have felt this impulse at some time to turn away from the horror. But Colin never shut his eyes from the truth. He was a courageous man. In South Africa, while still very young, he witnessed an accident when a white man ignored a stop sign and ran over a black cyclist. He volunteered a statement to the police, which the officers then wanted him to change. The driver was a good family man, they said, and it would all be much easier if the black man was at fault. But Colin stood his ground. He refused to change his statement, which was an act of great bravery in 1940s South Africa. He called it his Rubicon moment. He knew then that the system was rotten beyond saving and that he couldn't be complicit in it. Colin later moved to Australia, where he asked his new country the same relentless questions about our own colonial history. It was here in Australia that he founded the Centre for Comparative Genocide Studies. It was here that he conducted his work on the Shoah. This was a work of history. It was his attack on the idea that, to quote Colin, anti-Semitism arrived with Hitler from outer space in 1933. That was never true. The poison of anti-Semitism was spread by people, it was entrenched by institutions, it was enacted by communities. It could be traced backwards to actual decisions and actual causes. As he wrote, and I quote, this was a human event in history. It happened. It was done by people, so it must be explicable. Documenting this history in intense detail would be profoundly challenging for anyone, but particularly for a Jewish man. When he started teaching the Holocaust, he would tell his students, "You read the 1942 to 1945 materials and I'll meet you again at the Nuremberg trials." It was too awful to contemplate directly over and over again. But Colin was a courageous man, more courageous than most, and in time, he became a world-leading scholar of the Shoah. To look like he did, to truly look, was an act of heroism. His career was a monument to truth, the hardest, most painful, most testing truths. Like Captain McWhirr in Joseph Conrad's novel Typhoon, who said the best way to battle through a storm was to take it head on, facing it, always facing it. That's the way to get through it. Colin studied those truths because if he didn't, we would lose our shot at moral progress. Not every historian meets Colin's impossibly high bar. So, indeed, some of his own students didn't, according to Sandra, perhaps even some of the students that were members of his family. But absolute primacy of the search for truth defines every serious work of history. Without the search for the full truth, the whole truth, history doesn't make sense. If you pull one thread from the tapestry because you don't like it, the whole picture falls apart. How could you teach the history of China without the Long March or the Cultural Revolution or Tiananmen Square? How could you teach the history of the United States without slavery or the Civil War or freedom rides? How could you teach the history of ancient Rome without the brutality and slaughter that won its empire and which paid for all the art, poetry, trade, architecture, and political glory? Honesty doesn't always mean condemnation. It doesn't mean we give up our faith in redemption or forgiveness. These are great civilizations, some of the greatest in human history. Now, I understand the idea that there is one truth that can be pinned down is in itself contested. Of course, there will always be judgments and even arguments when we're writing history. None of us can have a perfect knowledge of the past. Some sources are too patchy. Sometimes the bridge of time and culture is too long to cross. When we study history, we're always making choices. The problem is people like the Federal Education Minister, Colin Tatz, want to make those choices themselves. They want the curriculum to reflect their politics more than the search for truth. They want to import ridiculous American history wars into Australian classrooms. But that's not protecting kids, that's weaponising them. We should be teaching our children that the contest of ideas is healthy. When little kids see their parents argue, it can be frightening. It can make them anxious. It's what happens next that matters. Do they talk it out? Does the stronger voice drown out everyone else's? The problem's not disagreement or contest or different points of view. It's keeping debates civil and grounded in fact. I have more reason than many to love Australia. My parents were refugees from Slovenia after World War II. They taught me to be grateful every single day, to value the freedom and riches that come with Australian citizenship. They saw authoritarian Yugoslavia up close and they knew that it is always better to live in a country that lets you practice your faith, that lets you vote out a government you don't like, that lets you think and speak freely about the world. I'm on the public record in my belief that Australian schools should be teaching our kids to cherish their citizenship, that students should learn and contemplate the Citizenship Pledge. It's freeing to know what it is to be a good citizen, to share democratic beliefs, respect the rights and liberties of others and obey the law. It is actually pretty simple. We don't pledge loyalty to the Crown in Australia anymore. We don't pledge loyalty to a political party or a particular religion. We pledge our loyalty to one another, to Australia and its people. I love this country, but I think love is deeper when it's more honest. As the Prime Minister said in his apology speech, we shouldn't be afraid of our history. We shouldn't recoil from terrible truths, like our failure to listen to the children who were taken from their parents, who were abused and neglected and ignored, or the failures that Paul Keating described in his Redfern speech, the failure to enter the hearts and minds of our First Nations people and ask, how would I feel if this were done to me? It's what all religions teach their faithful, the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And it applies to history as much as to the human soul. We examine our past behaviour as a nation because we want to be better as a people. We face the past with courage because we are confident that as a people it won't break us. I love my children more than life itself, but I don't think they're perfect. I draw their attention to how they can do better precisely because I love them. Some parents never pull their kids up, and could anybody honestly say their kids are better off for it. History shows us where we have succeeded. By most measures, we're richer, we're freer, we're fairer, and we should be proud of those achievements. But history also shows us where we can improve as a nation. No serious athlete, no business leader, no scientist thinks that they can ignore their past performance and still become better. They do the opposite. They probe, they analyse, they look for points of weakness. They're hungry for the truth because that's what helps them improve. It's only totalitarian regimes who whitewash their history. It was Stalin who photoshopped old comrades Walt out of his pictures. It's totalitarians who seek to delete the past, who deny people the truth. And they're not acting out of strength, but out of insecurity. That's why China seeks silence about Tiananmen Square. It's why ordinary Chinese people still don't know what really happened in Beijing in 1989. It's why in overriding the one country, two systems, China has accompanied these changes with a change to the way history is taught in Hong Kong. You might have seen this recently in the news. There's a new cartoon talking owl in Hong Kong schools, which teaches children how they can be more patriotic citizens of a greater China. But that's not us. Once our kids have the basics under their belts, reading, writing, maths, science, the basics, Australian parents and teachers should aim to teach our children how to think, not what to think, how to examine, challenge, research, test assumptions, check primary sources and make a case. In the face of a deliberate fake news campaign from pro-Russian forces, Finland decided to teach school children and adults too how to spot false information. They've been doing it for years, especially in the age of deep fakes and deliberate misinformation. Well-informed, curious citizens are the antidote to social divisions caused by online actors who want to divide us. So when we study history, it's not just victory or triumph that we teach as bravery, it's also resistance and even defeat. Resistance has formed us just as much as the decisions of the powerful have formed us. If you suggested to a European that teaching kids about the Shoah was giving them a black armband view of history, you'd be rightly condemned as a denier. Yet there are people who would have us deny the impact of colonisation on First Nations Australians and deny the resistance that sustains Aboriginal Australians to this day. That doesn't make us stronger. It doesn't help us solve the problems that are still with us today, because we can't heal intergenerational hurt until we face it. Sorry is a simple word, but when it's delivered sincerely, it can carry immense power. It took us too long to say it in this country. We know that now, and we still have so much to do to achieve true equality. But sorry was a precondition for moving forward. That's why Labor's committed to establishing a Makarrata Commission as part of our response to the Uluru Statement from the Heart. This would oversee a process of truth-telling to help build a lasting foundation for national reconciliation. When we discuss this history, it's not just colonisation and conquest. It's much richer and more interesting than that. It's the resistance that helped us form our national character. It's the pride in our united story when viewed through the deep history of this continent. 60,000 years of continuous culture to draw on, 60,000 years of survival and knowledge to learn from. What a unique gift. We're at our best when we look to this history, not hide from it. Blowing up Yukon Gorge, destroying rock shelters of exceptional value and heritage was an act of vandalism. And it can only happen when we fail to honour our history, when we protect it as an afterthought. That's why teaching our whole history is so important. Truth, reconciliation, and national progress walk hand in hand. Facing our history doesn't divide us, it unites us. It makes us tougher, more resilient, more mature as a country. After exercise, our muscles grow back stronger because of tiny tears that repair. When we repair the tears in our national fabric, we are stronger as a nation. When Julia Gillard announced her Royal Commission into child abuse, some very loud voices didn't want that to happen. It was controversial then, but no one thinks it's a mistake now. The truth, as painful as it was, has made us better. Colin understood this. That's why he dedicated his history, his career, to understanding humanity's very worst moments, even at enormous personal cost. As Colin taught us, we might be tempted to close our eyes, but we're always stronger when we confront the whole truth. Thank you.
Friends, I have very few words to say after that wonderful address. But on behalf of Plus 61J Media and the Tatz family, I'd like to thank everyone involved with this evening's oration. I'd like to thank Walt Secord for being our host, Vic Aladef for his wonderful tribute to Colin. I'd like to thank Auntie Joanne for that amazing acknowledgement of country. Thank you. She did it last year and it was just wonderful then, and it was wonderful tonight. But I'd really like to thank Tanya for her thoughtful address. Very different to the address that Stan gave us last year, and that actually, to me, demonstrates the breadth of interests of Colin, that whoever we ask to speak is going to find a totally different topic. But there are very important lessons in what you've said, Tanya, and I do thank you for bringing those issues forward and for us all to think upon as we go forward. Thank you for everyone who came here tonight. We had limited numbers and it's wonderful to welcome you. Particularly consider today's difficulties with the strikes and with the weather. So thank you. And thank you too to everyone who's watching us online. We hope you've enjoyed the second Colin Tatz Oration.